It has been a difficult day for many across Northern Ireland today, in particular for the people of Enniskillen, because as you know, today is the 30th anniversary of one of the worst atrocities of the Troubles. "30 years ago, an IRA bomb exploded at the town war memorial where crowds were gathered for Remembrance Sunday. Many of the victims were crushed by falling masonry. 11 people died that day and over 60 people were injured. A 12th victim, Ronnie Hill, lay in a coma for 13 years before passing away. Stephen Ross was just 15 at the time of the bomb. Every bone in his face was shattered. He lost most of his teeth and his legs were broken by falling masonry. Stephen Gault was with his father, who was killed in the bomb. His dad was decapitated by the blast. Helen Bonner was heavily pregnant back in 1987 and was 100 yards from where the bomb went off that day, with her 2-year-old son in a pram. Her daughter, Catherine, was born 2 weeks later and is about to turn 30. She's with us in the audience tonight. It's horrendous, obviously, when you think back to what has happened to people. Stephen Gault, we saw you mentioned in that film, you're a victims campaigner. When you think back to what happened that day, what are your memories?
My memories of that day, Stephen, are very vivid. I'll never forget what I seen that day. I remember standing at the cenotaph with my dad and taking up our position as we normally did at the reading rooms. And I remember a police officer had walked past and spoke to my dad, because he obviously knew him, because my dad served 28 years in the RUC and took early retirement due to ill health, and he was only 49 years of age. And I said to my dad, "Who was that?" I never got the answer. Next thing I remember is getting a push in the back and going forward. I never heard the explosion. Knocked unconscious. And when I came round, I tried to move and I was buried to the knees. I couldn't move. And my first thought was, where's my dad? And I looked down to my right and I seen a body. Didn't recognise him as my father. Buried, covered in rubble, dust, debris. And I only recognised him because of his shiny signature shoes. And I knew right away that was him. And it said there in your start, the decapitation, his head was gone from just above his left eyebrow. And I knew he was dead. Thankfully, he didn't suffer.
You know, people sometimes talk about drawing a line under the past, and when you see, this is a brutal question, but you know, you're living with this, and some people are not. Mm-hmm. When you see your father, and some of his head is blown away, how do you ever recover from that?
It's been a tough 30 years, Stephen, if I'm truthfully honest. It's been very, very tough, and thankfully I have a fantastic wife, Sharon, who's cared for me throughout my... I was very lucky that day with my injuries, but my condition worsened over the months and years afterwards. I was diagnosed 6 years after the bomb with psoriatic arthritis, and to this day I am sitting at the minute in constant pain. It's very difficult to see your father, as an 18-year-old, to see your father lying beside you, brutally murdered, along with 11 other innocent civilians. It's very difficult. Life has been very difficult, Stephen. I had to give up work due to ill health, and I suffer on a daily basis. And it's a constant reminder when I wake up in the morning in severe pain until I get my medication. It's every time I get a twinge, it's a constant reminder back to that fateful day 30 years ago.
Do you forgive those who did it?
Forgiveness is a difficult word, Stephen. Nobody has come and says we felt remorse for the murder of the people in Enniskillen. So personally...
Sorry to interrupt, but this is your dad we're looking at now.
It's very difficult. Nobody has come and owned up and was prosecuted for the Enniskillen Poppy Day bomb. So forgiveness for me, I honestly, truthfully, hand on my heart, I could not forgive them unless they came and pleaded forgiveness from me. But I personally couldn't forgive them, no. Some people in the audience might find that very hard to accept, but that's how I feel 30 years. Even 30 years on, Stephen, it's still very, very raw. Today was very emotional, very, very, even though it is 30 years on. And to answer your question, personally, I don't think I could ever forgive.
Stephen Ross, I know you do forgive. You were 15 years old when you were injured in the bomb. You were buried under the rubble, Stephen.
I'm not just buried, Stephen. Actually, it's a miracle I'm actually alive today because, it took 5 or 6 people to lift a slab of concrete, heavyweight piece of concrete off me, and I was curled up on a ball underneath it. And yeah, to go through that experience makes you reflect.
Do you remember?
Very vividly. You can't forget things like that, Stephen.
I hope this doesn't sound like a stupid question, but what is the sensation in your human body when you're buried in that rubble?
I think the sensation is more when you're pulled out. To not be able to open your eyes, all you can taste is blood and concrete, and to hear screaming noise and put your hand in your mouth and your teeth are gone and you can't feel your left leg below the knee, and you're sort of thinking, what's happened to me? What sort of condition am I in? It is a bit shocking, and I think it's more that when you become more conscious, more aware of it, Stephen, that you actually reflect on how much pain you have to go through. And those days were the initial period and the first week in intensive care were so painful. To sit through those times and reflect on Jim Dixon, who was pleading with the nursing staff, let him die, and Ronnie Hill lapsing into a coma that lasted 13 years before he died. To look back at those things, Stephen, is painful, but I think what gives me hope is that as a Christian, that my sense of justice isn't based on right or wrong in my opinion, and forgiveness is an issue that I can release, but as Stephen says, it's up to the people to ask for it. As Gordon Wilson said, I bear the people that did this no ill will. Gordon didn't say, I forgive them, but the media took that to mean, I forgive them.
Do you forgive the people who did this to you?
I have no bitterness to the people that did this, Stephen, absolutely none. What benefit is that to me? And as a person, I've been forgiven much. As a Christian, I've been forgiven much, so I can ask God to forgive the people that did this. Whether they seek that forgiveness is another question. But my responsibility is to ask for their forgiveness. And I've done that. I have no problem with that. And I'm genuinely looking at the audience and saying that from the heart, that if you can genuinely forgive someone, you should say it. If you can't, then don't.
What does it do to you long term, psychologically?
I think you could let something like this, and there are so many people who have been bereaved and injured by sectarian violence over the last 30 years, to let something like this, the anger of it, consume you. You've got to take the human emotion. I mean, at the end of the day, anger is a visitor. It shouldn't be a resident in your life. And you could let something like this become total fixation. It becomes your sole quest in life is to feel angry or to seek retribution. And what's that going to do? Is that going to bring back the people that died? Is that going to undo the suffering that you went through?
Helen, you were on your way to the cenotaph that day.
Yes, that's correct.
With your 2-year-old son.
Yes. I left the house that morning. It was funny because Stephen, my 2-year-old son, he would normally be awake real early in the morning, and he had been that morning, and because I was so tired, because I was heavily pregnant, I pushed him back into bed and made him go to sleep, and then I had to waken him after 10 o'clock. So got him out, walked down the town, and I was heading towards the cenotaph, and I saw a woman standing in a red coat, and I thought, that's my mother, I'll head towards her. And just as that, the bomb went off, and all I could think of was, is my mother dead? How am I going to have my second child without my mother about? I just couldn't believe what I'd seen.
If you think about the scenes, what your brain captured when that bomb went off, what is it?
I just couldn't believe it. I just couldn't believe that it happened. I just couldn't believe that a bomb could have been planted at the cenotaph and that nobody could have seen it. I didn't realise at that time it was behind in the reading rooms. I was just totally stunned, just in a state of despair. And at the time I did not know my father was actually there, and I thought he was down behind going to parade, but he was actually at the cenotaph that day.
What do you think of the people who could do that, who could plant the bomb there, walk away and not really care about how many people they killed? Indeed, the more people they killed, maybe the better. That's maybe how their warped minds would think.
Yeah, well, that's just it. I just feel they're very warped people, and I can't understand where they get their mentality from, how you can do that to another human being. I mean, you could hardly, if you killed a dog on the road, you would feel so sick about it. And how you can do that to human beings is just unbelievable, for no reason at all, for absolutely no reason. And I just think it's really terrible. what happened.
You said that you were pregnant.
Yes,
at the
correct.
time with your daughter Catherine.
Yes, that's correct.
Catherine's here, isn't she?
She is, yes. She's in the front row
Hi,
there.
Catherine.
How are you? How are you sleeping?
On 30.
Yeah.
And I was reading about your story, your mum and your story, and if your mum hadn't have stopped to talk to someone,
That's correct, yes.
you mightn't be here today.
That's right, yeah. Well, now, like, looking back, I've been 30 and a mother myself, like, I really realise how lucky I am.
What? You just stopped?
I just immediately, I just saw this cloud of smoke.
No, I mean
and-
you'd stopped to talk to someone?
Oh yes, I stopped to talk to somebody. Yes, that's correct. I stopped to talk to
And
somebody.
that's
on the
why you
way.
didn't walk
That's why
closer to the
I had.
bomb?
There was two reasons why. One was because Stephen slept in, which he wouldn't normally do, and secondly, I stopped to talk to somebody, and that sort of obviously was the reason why I wasn't so close, because I intended to head towards the woman with the red coat, but thankfully it wasn't my mother. Mummy had actually, I discovered her afterwards. She was sitting in church, very calm, which is very unlike her. I was totally shocked, and thankfully it wasn't her. And I met Peter Wilson. At the time, he lost his sister Mary, and he asked me had I seen his father and his sister, and everybody was just running about in despair. You know,
There was